I signed the papers in a courthouse bathroom because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the pen in the hallway. The mirror above the sink was cracked, splitting my face in two, and I remember thinking that this was appropriate, that something in me had already broken long before the judge said our names out loud. When I walked back into the courtroom, my husband Ethan was already seated, calm, confident. Dressed like this was a business meeting he expected to win. The judge spoke. Words about property, accounts, ownership. I heard my name, then his, then numbers that no longer belonged to me. I nodded when my lawyer touched my arm. It was over. Legally, cleanly, efficiently. Ethan took the house, the savings, the car, even the dog we adopted together because his work schedule was more stable, according to the paperwork. What he didn't take was the thing I had already stopped protecting. I didn't cry when it was done. That surprised people. Friends later told me I looked relieved. I wasn't relieved. I was empty in a way that feels like relief to people who have never been hollowed out slowly. Our marriage didn't collapse in a dramatic explosion. There was no screaming fight that broke the spell. No affair uncovered by accident. No suitcase slammed shut at midnight. It eroded quietly, the way skin breaks down under a cast you never remove. We met in Santa Fe, during a charity event neither of us really cared about. He was charming in a deliberate way, the kind of man who made eye contact as if he was choosing you specifically. I was 32, recently promoted, proud of my independence and tired of men who treated my ambition like a threat. Ethan admired it, or at least he said he did. For the first year, I believed him. He listened carefully, asked questions, remembered details. When I talked about work, he didn't interrupt. When I doubted myself, he reassured me with logic, not empty compliments. It felt mature, like something that would last. When we married 2 years later, people said we made sense together. We were calm. We were stable. We didn't fight in public. We hosted dinner parties with matching plates and neutral music playing softly in the background. Inside the house, things were quieter than they should have been. It started with small adjustments that felt reasonable. He handled finances better, he said, so it made sense for him to manage the accounts. He was more objective, less emotional. I agreed, relieved to let go of something that made me anxious. Then he suggested I move my paycheck into the joint account entirely. It was symbolic, he said, a sign of trust. I didn't want to seem guarded, so I did it. Later, when I wanted to make a large purchase, he asked me to run it by him first. Not because I needed permission, he clarified, but because couples communicate. I believe that too. The first time I felt embarrassed was when he corrected me in front of friends about a story I was telling. It was a small detail, but he smiled while doing it, like he was gently keeping things accurate. I laughed it off. That night, he told me I sometimes exaggerated when I was nervous. I started watching my words more carefully after that. Over time, my life shrank without me noticing. I stopped seeing certain friends because Ethan said they brought out the worst in me. I stopped taking work risks because he warned me about stability. I stopped talking about things that mattered to me because he would reframe them until I felt foolish for caring. Whenever I tried to explain that something hurt me, he listened patiently, then told me why I was misunderstanding his intentions. He never raised his voice. He never insulted me directly. He simply made my feelings seem inconvenient, like clutter that needed to be cleared. I learned to clean myself up before speaking. The night I realized I was disappearing, we were sitting at the kitchen table, the one he would later take in the divorce. I was telling him about an idea I had for work, something I was genuinely excited about. Halfway through my sentence, he checked his phone. He didn't apologize. He didn't look up. I stopped talking. He didn't notice. Something in me went very still. After that, I began keeping parts of myself hidden, not out of strategy, but out of exhaustion. It was easier to comply than to explain. Easier to agree than to be corrected. Easier to be quiet than to be reshaped again. By the time Ethan told me he wanted a divorce, I had already been gone for years. He framed it as a practical decision. We had grown apart. He needed peace. I wasn't the woman he married. He said this without cruelty, as if stating a fact about the weather. He had already spoken to a lawyer. He had already organized the paperwork. He had already decided what was fair. I nodded and listened. During the negotiations, he was generous with explanations and stingy with concessions. He reminded me of the financial contributions he had made, the risks he had taken, the stability he had provided. When my lawyer pushed back, Ethan looked genuinely confused, like he couldn't understand why anyone would question his logic. I let him have almost everything. People assumed I was defeated, that I was too tired to fight, that I had been manipulated into submission. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. I didn't want to take anything with me that belonged to the person I had become in that marriage. The day I moved out, I packed a single suitcase. Clothes, toiletries, a notebook I had hidden in the back of a drawer for years. I left behind furniture, photos, books we bought together, objects that carried the shape of a life that no longer fit me. Ethan watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expression neutral. When I reached for the dog's leash one last time, he cleared his throat. The agreement was clear. The dog stayed. I nodded and let go. He said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly, like a man offering advice to someone he believed would regret not listening. I didn't answer. That night, alone in a small rented room on the edge of town, I slept on the floor. The mattress wouldn't arrive until morning. The room smelled like fresh paint and dust. The window faced a parking lot, lit by a single flickering lamp. I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for panic, for grief, for the collapse everyone warned me about. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar stretch inside my chest. Silence. Not the heavy silence of avoidance, but the open kind, the kind that waits instead of presses. For the first time in years, there was no one monitoring my reactions, correcting my tone, managing my emotions for me. I didn't know yet what Ethan had taken, but I knew what he hadn't. In the weeks after the divorce, people kept asking me what I would do next, as if there was supposed to be a plan that replaced the marriage immediately. I didn't have one. I woke up early, drank coffee alone, went to work, came home, and sat with myself in ways I hadn't been allowed to before. At first, it was uncomfortable. Without Ethan's constant framing, I didn't know how to interpret my own thoughts. I would feel anger and wait for someone to explain why it was irrational. I would feel excitement and instinctively suppress it, expecting it to be dismissed. The notebook I had packed became my anchor. I wrote without structure, without purpose, without worrying if what I felt was reasonable. I wrote about things I missed and things I didn't. I wrote about moments in the marriage that had confused me, times when I had apologized without understanding why. Patterns emerged on the page that I had never been able to see while living inside them. 3 months after the divorce, Ethan emailed me. The subject line was neutral, administrative. He had discovered an issue with one of the accounts he now fully owned. A discrepancy. Something didn't add up. He wanted to know if I had moved money. I read the email twice, calm in a way that surprised me. I replied simply that I hadn't. Because I hadn't. Over the next few weeks, more messages followed. Polite at first, then sharper. He couldn't locate certain documents. He couldn't access a professional contact he needed. A recommendation he had expected to be automatic never came through. I realized then what he was starting to feel. Throughout our marriage, I had been the invisible infrastructure. I remembered dates, maintained relationships, smoothed over conflicts, kept his professional world quietly organized. I wrote the emails he dictated. I scheduled the meetings he took credit for. I made him look competent in rooms where he would have otherwise been merely confident. He had taken the house, the money, the visible assets. What he had taken without understanding was the assumption that I would always be there to hold things together. The final email came 6 months later. He said he was struggling, that things were harder than he expected, that the divorce hadn't brought the clarity he thought it would. He asked if we could talk, just to clear the air. I didn't reply. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But because the woman who would have explained herself to him no longer existed. Sometimes I imagine Ethan standing in that house, surrounded by objects he won, wondering why they feel heavier now. Why success doesn't land the way it used to. My rooms feel quieter without being peaceful. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him regret. I simply live with the knowledge that when he took everything in the divorce, he took the wrong things, and left behind the one thing I was finally ready to reclaim: myself. Even now, I sometimes catch myself waiting for correction. I will finish a sentence and pause, expecting someone to reframe it, to explain why what I meant wasn't quite right. The pause no longer fills with another voice. It fills with air. I am learning to stay inside it. There are mornings when I wake up before the alarm, not because of anxiety, but because my body has stopped bracing for the day. I notice small things first. The way sunlight moves across the wall. The sound of traffic in the distance. The fact that my thoughts begin where I am, not where someone else needs me to be. For a long time, I believed peace was something negotiated, something maintained through compromise and restraint. I confused calm with safety, silence with stability. What I didn't understand was how much energy it took to remain agreeable, how much of myself I had slowly traded away to keep everything smooth. That cost doesn't show up on balance sheets. It shows up in hesitation, in the way your shoulders tense before you speak, in the instinct to explain yourself even when no explanation is required, in the habit of shrinking your needs so they fit more easily into someone else's plans. After the divorce, those habits didn't disappear overnight. They surfaced in ordinary places. At work, when I deferred automatically, even when I knew the answer. With friends, when I apologized for taking up time. With strangers, when I softened my voice without realizing why. But now, when I notice it, I don't shame myself. I observe it. I let it pass. Awareness is quieter than self-judgment, but far more effective. There was a moment, almost a year later, when I ran into Ethan unexpectedly. It happened in a bookstore near my apartment. I was standing in the aisle, reading the back of a novel I had chosen without consulting anyone, when I heard my name spoken carefully, as if testing whether it was still allowed. He looked older. Not dramatically so, but unsettled around the edges. His posture was the same, confident by habit, but the ease behind it was gone. We exchanged pleasantries. Neutral, polite, brief. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. It was true. There was a pause where something else might have been said. An opening he was used to stepping into. I didn't offer it. He nodded, smiled thinly, and walked away. I stood there for a moment longer, then returned to the book in my hands. My heart rate never changed. That was when I knew the story had fully ended. People sometimes misunderstand this kind of ending. They expect anger or closure delivered through confrontation. They assume freedom comes from saying everything you never said. In my experience, freedom came from no longer needing to. The marriage had trained me to explain myself endlessly, to justify reactions, to translate emotions into something more acceptable. Silence now feels like a privilege rather than a punishment. I no longer measure my worth by how useful I am to someone else. I no longer confuse being needed with being loved. I understand the difference now, not intellectually, but physically. My body recognizes it. When I think back on the divorce settlement, I see it clearly. Ethan took the visible structure of a life. I walked away with its foundation. He kept the house, but not the sense of home. He kept the money, but not the steadiness it once represented. He kept the objects that proved something had existed, without realizing that proof is not the same as substance. I kept the quiet knowledge of who I am when no one is watching. There are still losses I carry. The dog I sometimes think I hear in my dreams. The years I might have lived differently. The version of myself that learned too early how to disappear. I don't romanticize those losses. I acknowledge them. Then I set them down. Because what replaced them is not bitterness, but clarity. Clarity is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It stays. It allows you to see patterns without assigning blame. It lets you tell the truth without turning it into a weapon. The truth is this. Ethan didn't take everything because he couldn't. He only took what could be counted, cataloged, transferred. He took what the system recognizes as valuable. He left behind what no document could describe. He left behind the part of me that knows when to stay and when to leave. The part that recognizes quiet control disguised as care. The part that no longer confuses endurance with devotion. That part belongs to me now. And I protect it carefully. Not with walls, but with attention. With boundaries that do not require explanation. With a life that expands instead of contracts. I don't tell this story to be admired. I tell it because it happened, and because there are women who will recognize themselves in the spaces between the sentences. Women who are still sitting at tables where no one notices when they stop speaking. Women who believe peace is something earned through silence. It is not. Peace is what remains when you stop negotiating your existence. I learned that too late to save the marriage, but early enough to save myself.